everyone. Myself, Pritali Modak. On behalf of Modakshar Academy, I warmly welcome you all to today's International webinar. Today's topic is the author and the present, Ole Soyinka. This webinar explores the remarkable life and literary contribution of Ole Soyinka, Nobel laureate, playwright, poet, essayist, and one of the world's most courageous voice for justice and human dignity. His experience of imprisonment transformed into powerful literary works that continue to inspire readers across the globe. We are deeply honored to have with us our distinguished speaker, Professor Swati Bhattacharya. Professor Bhattacharya is an eminent academic and scholar whose insightful perspective on literature and culture have enriched countless students and audience. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Swati Bhattacharya for graciously accepting our invitation and sharing her valuable knowledge with us today. Without any further delay, I respectfully invite Professor Swati Bhattacharya to deliver her lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much for the beautiful and brief introduction. Now, I've already introduced you to the African literature in 2, 3 previous lectures, and now I thought that it would be interesting to talk about some individual authors who had brought in a change in the life of the Africans, not only in the life of the Africans, but in their intellectual field also. Now, my today's lecture, just a minute. Is it visible? Is the presentation visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Can you please like full your presentation, like full screen of presentation?
Okay. Is it okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, the title of my presentation is Soyinka, the author and the prison. Now, the title is significant in the sense that when Soyinka was put into the prison, his identity as an author was kind of taken away from him, because when he was put into the prison in 1967, he was already a published author who had poems published internationally in many journals and a few plays already published and one novel. So he was a renowned author, but when he was put into the prison, he was treated as just an ordinary prisoner. So the author, but an author is an author, and in his stay in the solitary confinement, without any trial and without any proper allegation, he was put into the prison, and then he, in order to survive intellectually, he took refuge to his only accomplishment, that was writing. And this is one of the major quotes of the, today we'll be talking about the prison diary, The Man Died. And this is the most quoted line from that book. The man dies in all who keep silent in the face of tyranny. He chose to die in the prison. Ultimately, he didn't die, but he accepted that because he could not remain silent in the face of tyranny, the tyranny that was going on in Nigeria during that period. Now, thus, The Man Died is not a journal or diary in the proper sense of the term, because he didn't have a diary. He couldn't put the dates on it, and as he writes in the beginning of the book, that he had smuggled, he could, with the help of his friends, smuggle a few books. And one of them was his own book, Isara, and he used to write between the lines. He could manage to get a stub of a pencil, and with that, he managed to write between the lines. And later on, even when he was publishing the diary, he says that I couldn't name the volumes, I couldn't name the books in which I have made the notes or for the prison diary or have noted my experience. So, but before we go to this prison diary, as he calls it, we'll just take a brief glance about his childhood and his background. Now, Oluole, actually his name was Oluole, but he cut it short and made it Ole. He was born in Abeokuta, Ogun State, on the 13th day of July. So just 2 days back was his birthday, his 93rd birthday, as the second of 6 children of Samuel and Grace Troinka. He would then head over for primary school in Abeokuta, where he won several prizes for literary composition. After this stage, he moved to Ibadan, where he was accepted by Government College Ibadan and moved to the University College Ibadan, where he studied English literature, Greek and Western history. After that, he went to UK at the University of Leeds for his further studies, and when he came back, he actually comes from a family that was very much aware of the socio-political condition of Nigeria. Even his mother was an activist, his father was a clergyman, but he was a very socially conscious man, and from his family only, he knew, he had learned to protest and not to compromise. Now, after he came back, he found that the Nigeria he came back to a free, quote unquote, Nigeria. But when he had come back, he realized that this Nigeria was not at all different from the colonial Nigeria. Now, actually, this is something all of us know, but just a quick revision of the situation, that during the colonial period, there was a binary that everything white was good and everything black was bad. And the common men, the ordinary men, they were oppressed by the whites. But after some time, naturally, there was a resistance and a cry for freedom. I'm just telling it very simply because in order to appreciate or in order to depreciate the situation that followed. Now, what happened? There was this cry for freedom, and who were at the head of it? It were the intellectuals, it was the elite, the educated people. And as is seen in most of the countries, the mass, the ordinary people, they had hopes, they were led by the promises made by their leaders, and they died, they fought, and they struggled for freedom. What happened? These white people, they created a group of black-white people. That is, who were black by skin, but who had imbued the ideology and the way of administration and operation. They've learned it from the whites. So when the white people left the country, or they were forced to leave the country, they left these people who were ideologically no different from them. So what happened to the common people? And what happened to the ideologies, the intellectuals? They were left on the fence, and the ordinary people, for the ordinary people, the year 1960 had marked a year of hope, had marked a year of promises. They thought that everything would change, and they awaited the change. But when it came from 60 to say 67, when this civil war or the Biafran war started, it was just a few years of disillusionment when they realized that they were left where they were. And these administrators, these rulers who had black skin, were not only wearing a white mask, had hardly any sympathy for the ordinary people. So what happened that they naturally, there were, as I had told you earlier, if you don't remember, there were 300 odd tribes, and of course they didn't live in harmony, but the three major tribes, the two major tribes were Yoruba and Igbo, and they had been staying in kind of a peaceful compromising situation, but now the leaders started playing on it. And what happened in 1967, it culminated into a major war. But before that, just have a quick look in what Soyinka had been doing. He has been long been a proponent of Nigerian democracy. The word democracy is very important because it was a dream of democracy that had the common people dream of a new country. Now, his decades of political activism include periods of imprisonment and exile, and he founded, headed, and participated in several political groups. His imprisonment didn't end with this 1967 imprisonment, but it continued again and again. He had to go underground. He had stayed larger part of his life outside Nigeria, but now he had come back. His life has comparatively improved after 1986, when he had won the Nobel Prize, and we'll come to that later. But before that, let's quickly look at it. And pro-national conference organizations in 2010, Soyinka founded the Democratic Front for a People's Federation and served as chairman of the party. Well, by the end of this presentation, we'll be at 2020 and we'll see what he says, what was his take on this long life that he had been living. But now back to the solitary confinement. This is what he said. This is what I've already told you, but this is exactly from the book. While in solitary confinement, he scrawled notes and poems using meat bones. So he could scratch. And then later on, when he could manage to get some ink or a stub of a pencil, he wrote upon it. Handmade ink. He says that I made ink with dust and used toilet paper for writing. Now, those ideas become the memoir, The Man Died, published in 1972. He had to take some time to look at his experience objectively before he could publish the book. But let's take a brief glance to the situation that led to his imprisonment. And I've already referred to Biafran War or Civil War. Now, what was its nature? Now, the Biafra War or Nigerian Civil War was a deadly conflict fought between the Nigerian federal government and the secessionist state of Biafra. Now, actually, as I told you, after the independence, these ethnic, religious, and economic tensions, they started began to infuriate the people, because this British colonial rule has injected this hostility among these ethnic groups, and the war resulted in an estimated 1 to 3 million deaths, primarily from starvation and disease, caused by a federal blockade. But thousands had died, and at one time, this federal government, the head of the government, he had ordered to kill all the Igbo people, Igbo men rather, who were at more than 10-year-old. Just imagine, they were made to stand in a democratic, quote unquote, free country, and they were killed like that. Actually, what had happened is that these people, this is a Biafra, what they are called secessionists, and they thought that they would make a separate state where the majority of Igbo people would be living. Now, during the years, this General Yakubu Gowon, as I've been referring to him, served as the head of the state of Nigeria. He had become the head of the Nigeria because of a coup. And before that, there was a coup. This was a counter coup that brought him at the helm of the Nigerian government. Now, while Biafra was led by Lieutenant Colonel Chukwu Emeka, he was better known as Emeka Ojukwu. Now, the conflict emerged from political, ethnic, cultural, and religious tensions because people were starving as it is. The Igbo people were being driven away from north of Nigeria, and they started going eastwards where they originally lived in the pre-colonial period. So they went there, and this Emeka, he was a lieutenant colonel and ruler of that area, lieutenant governor of that area, and he said that let's break away from Nigeria and we'll make a separate country known as Biafra. But apparently it seems that General Yakubu Gowon was too worried that a part of Nigeria was going away. But actually the game was not that simple. It's not that Gowon was worried about the integrity and unity of Nigeria. The game had a much deeper layer. This area, the Biafran area, this area is the oil mine of Nigeria. It supplies oil to the European countries also. And we had here a company called Burma Shell. It was Shell originally. They had invested lots in this oil fields. Now what happened? Though the British had left Nigeria, again quote unquote, they had the economic control over Nigeria, which they did not want to lose. So what happened when this Biafran war started in 1967, then what happened? Yakubu Gowon appealed to the UK government, who supplied them with lots of arms and ammunitions. And that the people of the world, that the people of Nigeria don't understand this underhand help, those arms and ammunitions were transported to Nigeria in ordinary aeroplanes. So naturally, and of course, there was the big brother Russia, who also helped UK. Now, USA was neutral at the time because USA was busy at the Vietnam War. So, USA was neutral, but the help of UK and Russia was enough to sail Gowon through this war. So, what happened? This resulted, and naturally, what happens when there is a war, as we have been seeing? There was a blockade, a land blockade and a sea blockade. So you can't eat oil. So the people started whatever they had in store, they finished that, and they were fighting with their own arms and ammunitions, which compared to these supplied to them were not up to the mark. So they were being defeated, they were being killed, and on top of that was this oppression, the decision of the federal government that they were out to kill all the Igbos if possible. So millions of people died in the war, thousands died in the war, and others died of starvation because there was no food supply. So there was, and the helpful bodies like Red Cross were not allowed to enter. So here you can see, this is a photograph from that time. You can see the helpless look on the children and the women. They have all come for some kind of food. You can see the empty cups. They have come for the relief. But how much relief can you stick in? So it was a pathetic condition, and there are lots of African women, African authors who had written books on this Biafran war. And the very famous Nigerian author, many of you have heard of her, Adichie. Adichie has also got a book on this Biafran war. And these finally made a secession, intellectual secession between the Uroba and the Igbo and Hossa Fulani tribes who used to live in the north. So what Soyinka had done, Soyinka was actually trying to move in a peaceful coordination. So what he did, he sought the help of people, the intellectuals, and so that they could help the potential victims escape capture and probable execution. The government suspected him of what? They thought that maybe he was planning to assassinate the members of this federal government, and they wanted him to confess about the treason that he was undertaking. Again, quote unquote, because they were suspicious of him while he was just trying to work as a emissary of peace, because so many life was getting lost. Now, this is more or less a July story because the Biafran War also started on 6th of July. So the government's misinterpretation became a key element of Soyinka's confrontational prison experience, and partially it dictated the dramatic structure of the book. It is almost like a 3-act play because there are so many ups and downs, because this was not only a stay in the prison where he was trying his best to physically survive. The psychological torture and the problem of surviving as a sane person was really, really challenging. So here are some quotations from the book, and we'll just go through it. It was a very testing period for me. 22 months in total isolation, denied books, denied paper. They were the sustenance of his existence. An author, and he was a teacher at the time. He was in prison. He was kind of picked up from the gate of his university, the University of Ife. He was coming out after taking the class, and he was imprisoned. So, and he was denied everything. My cell constantly searched, nothing at all to sustain my mind. Time to time, the officials came, and just these are known stories. But what is important or what is ironical is that this was happening to an internationally famous author, and this was about denying his intellectual status as well as jeopardizing his physical status. Now, I think he says one of the most cunning categories of humanity that I've ever encountered is the prisoner. The prisoner has to survive. It's a survival test. You are challenging yourself. Yes, I'll overcome. I will survive. Not a question of self-advancement. So for an intellectual person, a creative person, to spend 22 months in a jail without any intellectual advancement is punishment enough. And he thought that he would soon go mad if he couldn't write, if he couldn't think, if he couldn't keep sane. Now, in the next two quotations, we'll see the attempts he made to keep himself sane. He says, I remember when I used to hallucinate. So I would leap up and try to destroy those kind of hallucinatory images that came out. He felt that I'll go mad. Only mad people hallucinate. Only mad people see things like I'm seeing. So I can't afford to be mad. I must retain my sanity. But eventually, I mastered all that period. And after that, I began recollecting those formula and geometry and trigonometry which I had hated. And I began pulling them back, making calculations on the ground. And that's why he says, after this only, he says that I made ink with dust. Just imagine. Believe it or not, I rediscovered the theory of permutations and combinations. Those things I had hated in school became my sustenance. So he kept on recollecting the difficult problems in geometry, trigonometry. There are detailed descriptions of this, but I've just picked up a few lines so that you might feel interested and read the book. This is a wonderful book, and it is not just showing a story. It is a multi-dimensional book that kind of reveals the paradoxes that a government can create for one of its subjects, number one. Then how much struggle a man is forced to do in order to just survive physically and remain sane. Apparently, those of us who just are, we never realize this. Only when challenged, only when our existence is at crisis and our essence is also at crisis. He is essentially a creative person. So that what I told you, that it was his identity as an author was denied. There was all sorts of attempt to delete his identity as an author, and at the same time that he was a human being, even that was denied. And he kept on going on hunger strikes again and again. Now, I'll just share with you the first part. In the first part, just after a few days, he was imprisoned. One of the guards, he came with a chain, and he was really shocked. What was this chain for? But they put both his legs in chain. So this is dehumanizing. After all, there is nothing they could really prove against him. He didn't have any trial. From time to time, one of the government representatives came and asked him to confess, and when he didn't apparently, again, quote unquote, cooperate, these kind of things started happening. And when the next time that man came and he said that, why have I been put into chain? Then he said, oh, I don't know, there was no order. And when he had asked the guard has named that officer and said that they have ordered to put him in the chain. So what could he do? He could only go for a hunger strike. Now, this is something interesting. When that officer came back and he said, "Why aren't you eating?" So he said, "Can't you see that my legs are in chain?" So he said, "What has that got to do with your food?" So he said that yes, that lots of things are involved. Why? Because the most difficult thing for me is to walk if I have the chains on my legs. Fine. And the place that I have to go is the toilet. So if I don't eat, then I don't have to go. And if I don't drink water, I would not have to go for that also. So I'm just drinking 2 glasses of water. The glasses of water was there, and he didn't, he refused to eat anything. Ultimately, for the time being, they put him out of the chain, but again, this happened. Again, something else, some other means of torture was devised, and again he had to go on hunger strike. So actually, the man died touches you somewhere within, because Shoinka was able to regard in this book. When he was writing, the book was being published, in retrospective, Shoinka was able to regard his prison experience with the detachment necessary for understanding. So this is, of course, what we can expect from an accomplished writer, a poet. We can expect this from him only. He was a very sensitive person, and so it becomes, instead of a prison diary, as he calls it, it becomes a work of literature. You can see, I have already told you that he was very famous at the time, and you can see how people, how the newspapers have reported his confinement, and then the chain incident that I told you just now, old Shoinka unchanged and unchanged. Unchanged, and then old Shoinka is being quizzed. So these are different pages from the local newspaper that published this issue, and for all those 22 months, they kept on publishing about his condition. So that is why I said that this denial of his identity is what pained him more. And somehow he used to keep in touch with the outside world. He had his friends who very surreptitiously maintained their relationship with him. But even after getting this prison diary published, he said, "I can't publish their name, and I can't be ungrateful to them, because if their name is disclosed, we don't know what would happen to them." So this is really very, what shall I say, very good work of literature. And because there is a remarkable array of tones, the style keeps on changing from comedy of manners. There is some green humor, and then sometimes it takes up the tone of a cool political essay. But there are those odd moments recorded when he was really losing his mind. And there are dramatic scenes, and it shifts from the dramatic scenes with lengthy dialogue characters, because he has written poems, he has written lots of essays, he has written novels, but he is basically, what I feel, is a dramatist. And so what happened, this prison diary has also this pulsating dramatic energy in it, and their portrayals of the officers and the people he has met in the prison, and the kind of sharing they had. They were very brief, but they were very poignant, and they were very emotive. and thus it places his personal prison experience within a larger cultural and political context. And the non-African Western culture represented by his, I told you he was a professor, he was a very erudite person. So there are references to the Greek heroes, there are references like Odysseus or Prometheus or Oedipus even. And then the Christian ideology that speaks of compassion and forgiveness. And the side by side, he places the political corruption and power struggles of contemporary Nigeria. And what I find most significant in the memoir's form and meaning is his use of Uroba mythologies. He has written quite a number of plays, as I've told you, even before he was imprisoned, and one of them is Dance of the Forest, and another is the Death and the King's Horseman. So in both of them, he has made extensive use of Uroba mythology, but here perhaps he was reminded of it not because of his belief that you cannot kill a poetic spirit. It survives through generation. And because the poets, the author, they are the visionary. You can kill the author, but you can't kill the visionary. So he makes use of this Uroba mythology, but the interpretation was a modern interpretation, and the perspective was again a modern perspective, and he reinterpreted them. And it was only after considerable reflection that Soyinka was able to comprehend that his mind might be shattering, but his spiritual experience, the spiritual convictions woven into these mythological tales are one of the ways of survival. So, in the light of this traditional African mythological stories and beliefs, he found a recluse. He believed that this spirit, the creative spirit that is represented through Ogun, that cannot be killed. This idea is very much reflected in his play, The Dance of the Forest, and he kind of reincarnates those spirits in his solitary confinement days. Now, so early in his memory, he warns the readers that this dramatic, he doesn't want to create some dramatic situation in order to impress. Now, if I can ask, I can share this with you. This book, what is very interesting, this book has got a long preface. And this preface tells about experience of a doctor, starts with the experience of a doctor in 1983. So 10 years after this book was published. And in this preface, he one by one picks up incidents that were used to torture the humanity, the torture the people of Nigeria, and crush them both intellectually and physically. This doctor was picked up from his chamber and he was beaten, and even before his wife could contact with the police, because he was a quite famous doctor and he had people he knew in the government, but before any action could be taken, he was beaten in such a way that though he hasn't lost his mind, he has lost the use of his hands. So why he has included this in the preface? Because he wants to very subtly indicate that the situation hasn't changed much. Goan has gone, but his successors are no more empathetic towards the people and as insecure as him. unless the government is insecure, they wouldn't get hold of people who are the visionaries, who are the dreamers of dreams, and who can be the true leader, true intellectual leader to the people. So, and before the tensions, the Nigeria broke out into open civil war. This I have already told you. And then, when they couldn't get a confession from him, failing that, it means the government wrote and forged a confession, and in other ways made it appear that Soyinka not only had betrayed his country by siding with the Igbos because he was Uroba. This would appeal to the mass who wouldn't understand the complicated web of politics, but had confessed and was penitent as well. Soyinka offers his background to his imprisonment. His actual activities may have been the cause of his arrest, he says, but the government's case against him was based on false evidence. They just projected the case as they wanted to. And this is what had pained him the most. And of course, again and again, he repeatedly says that this universal pattern of oppression, this universal reflection of insecurity has been seen all over the world, but this had helped him to structure his prison experience. And the memoir thus could be an organic form, and it seems that as if it springs out like a spring out of this terrifying reality, and it was almost like a flash, and it came to Soyinka only after problems and expediency had changed the format, the conception of this book at least a dozen times. I quote this, change the format, this is a quotation, title, conception of this book at least a dozen times, till he could really reflect that flash in the book. And he had decided to tell that he is an uncompromising soul, and he believes that an artist, a visionary, should be true to his own self, and that is why he was not ready to compromise, and he, without compromising, he would tell the world this unvarnished truth. Now, as I had told you, that this is almost like a 3-act play, and in all these 3 acts, the central movement comprises a break from everyday world. And because the isolation was forced, it was not his choice, and a return for something he had not done. So for Soyinka, this later on, this takes a meaning within his present world, his present existence, which is in isolation, his world outside where he had acted, and the mythological world. It's a 3-layered experience that he weaves into this tale of the solitary sail. And I told you that this is there were 3 parts in this, and this prison notes, as I told you just now, are divided according to time and place of imprisonment. This is clarified in the context itself. Ibadan, Lagos, August to December 1967, and this jail had a very funny name. I mean, it's funny to us. It's Kirikiri jail. And then the next 2 jails where he was kept, there are Kaduna 68 and Kaduna 69. That is in 68 and 69. Appendices that offer substantiating documents, testimonies, and eyewitness accounts that he is not prevaricating. And finally, a postscript in which Soyinka threatens to reveal documentary evidence of atrocities committed by federal troops, if the government or poised historians of the establishment ever attempt to deny the genocide practiced against the Igbo. Now, I just, this is a page from the book. I chose it purposely, and I'll just read 3-4 lines from the second paragraph. When a dictatorship is imposed on your country, the very first thing you feel, the very first day, and it is a feeling that has a totally spontaneous immediacy, free from all mental elaboration. The first feeling is humiliation, and that is what was driving him mad. You are being deprived of the right to consider yourself worthy of responsibility for your own life, dehumanization, and destiny. The feeling of humiliation grows day by day as a result of the oppressor's unceasing effort to force your mind to accept all the vulgarity which makes up the abortive world of the dictators. You feel as if your reason and your human status were being deeply insulted every day. And then comes the attempt to impose on you by fear acceptance of various barbarous actions of theirs that you hear about or that you actually see, then commit against your fellow human beings. Dehumanization of mind. You begin to live with a daily humiliation of fear, and you begin to loathe yourself. And then, deeply wounded in your conscience as a citizen, you begin to feel a solidarity with the people to whom you belong. So it is at the same time an obliterating of the identity and a rediscovery of the identity. Who am I? Am I the dehumanized being that they are turning me into, or am I better than that? So this is another quotation. Indeed, it is a certitude of an indestructible continuum of ordeal, survival, affirmation to myself that no, I am not this, I am better than this. Constantly reinforced by the knowledge of predecessors in this cycle, which sustains a prisoner in his darkest moments, and with his liberty regained, urges on him a pledge and a duty to all victims of power, sadism in and outside of his own country. That is why I said this is obliterating and rediscovering the identity. That I am bound to help, I am bound to my people, I am responsible for my people, and I, being a victim, must contribute in a better way to all the victims of power and sadism. Now, these are some of the quotations randomly taken. I don't know any other way to live but to wake up every day armed with my convictions, not yielding them to the threat of danger and to the power and force of people who might despise me. I don't care. But it is very difficult to keep this conviction alive when you are in such a situation. Now, the greatest threat to freedom is the absence of criticism. So they can't accept any criticism. Then, chance for Shoinka's release. He knows that man diet is not a textbook for survival, but a private record of one survival. How I survived. But the context, the perspective is huge. Designed to refresh the world conscience on the continuing existence of the thousands of souls held under perverted power. So on the very opening page of chapter 1, in comparing, I told you he referred to Greek mythology, the Christian theology. So comparing his own experience with that of a Greek professor, George Mangakis, Shoinka had already announced the universal pattern that structured his prison experience. So we can say that we have come almost to the end, but before that, I would just like to tell you something, that we can say that The Man Died is one of those rare literary works that helped document the chaos in African countries soon after independence and struggles for power, the corruption, the conflicts between African and Western ideologies, and between the tribal and national interests, and the apparent inability to accommodate all the traditional values to the modern world. This is quite ironical because ultimately the traditional values came to his help, to his sustenance. And we can say that Shoinka was caught up in a struggle in which a tribal power structure in the north and east resisted containment by central national authority. A whole country is controlled by an autocratic authority, and he sought peaceful means, and he suffered ignominy, humiliation, and depression. So this work is really important in understanding Shoinka's own role in the struggle and his commitment to his people, and he had responded in the only way he could, and that is through his literature. And The Man Died, that emerges, is a much more active, I should say. It's pulsating, I told you. You can feel the pulse, and very active, sensitive, and creative, of course. And there are metaphysical layers that are equally important. And he would continue to, on the same vein, this experience only helped him to mature as a committed author. He was already committed author, and his works are full of satirical comments. They're not very subtle satires, you can easily understand, and they are almost, I should say, they're very intrusive satire. It can't help having an effect, or it would have a definite effect on you. So now we've come to the end of it. We've already discussed the book, and if you feel interested, you can read it. Now I'm just updating you that though he considers himself, and me too, primarily a playwright, Shoinka also published the novels The Interpreter, Seasons of Enemy, The Chronicles from the Land of Happiest People on Earth. The latter, of course, the last one I haven't read, the latter of which drew particular praise for a satirical take in corruption in Nigeria. Upon its release, when the book was published, though I haven't read the book, I really liked what he said. Shoinka told The Guardian that he had attempted to complete it before the 60th anniversary of Nigeria's independence in 2020. He also said, I wanted this to be my present to the nation, to the people who live here, both the governed and those who govern, the exploiters and the exploited. The exploited has gone under the photograph, please excuse me. So he says, I believe that the best learning process of any kind of craft, here literary craft, is just to look at the work of others. So work of others would only enrich you and help you to choose your own path. Then it always reminds people that one of the most brutal dictators we had here. Now, this is very interesting. I must tell you that this is a part of the interview that was taken just last year for the Guardian paper, and here he very jokingly says, the question was, what did you feel, or what was the reaction in the country after you had won the Nobel Prize? So he says that I always remind people that one of the most brutal dictators we had here, Sani Abacha, would have gone in his grave a happy man if he hanged a Nobel laureate. If he may be able to put that on his CV, as it is, he had to be content with hanging an activist, a writer, and his 8 companions. I'm referring to King Saro over here, because he is very satirically says that he would have been happy to hang me, but as if it is very difficult to hang a Nobel laureate. So instead, he hanged another author. So the man died because he had to oppose the tyrannical rule. So it exposed me to a very great dangers, because I refused to back down on my beliefs, on my activities, simply because I am become a Nobel laureate. I'll go on my own way. I didn't ask you to give me that Nobel Prize. So why should I stop things which preoccupied me before the Nobel? But later on, he adds, it was grand when one after the other African Nobel winners began to come in. Now I have been able to enjoy for some time, now being a Nobelist, rather being feeling sometimes like a showpiece. I was a showpiece, but now I feel that I'm a Nobelist, not a novelist. You see the pun and the subtle satire hidden underneath. So we come back to where we had started. The man dies in all who keep silent in the face of tyranny. So we are dead men walking. We can't oppose the tyranny, but he did not die, because though all attempts were undertaken to kill him, both physically and mentally, but he continued with his belief. The writer is a visionary of his people. He anticipates, he wants. And that is why the man died is such an important piece of literature. Thank you.